Hello and welcome. The origin of the Fantastic Four is somewhat apocryphal and has a few conflicting versions. These conflicting versions are partially because the creators, Lee and Jack Kirby, didn't get along very well near the end of Kirby's life. But even that statement has contradictory evidence. In interviews, Kirby seemed rather displeased with Lee, but at conventions, he was known to be quite friendly with him. So this topic contains a lot of nuance and requires a fair amount of context. Finally, one has to separate what happened in the early days of Marvel with what happened later when the company became a success. Specifically, how titles were created and produced using the infamous Marvel method. While the basics of the Marvel method were consistent for most creators, there are differences that emerge, especially when examining the working relationship between Lee and Kirby. It evolved out of necessity, as the two were cranking out tons of material and a certain trust developed between them. In other words, there's the generic Marvel method, and then there's the Marvel method as it applied to Kirby after a specific but not specific point. Using the general version, most artists would receive a written plot outline that might include a page breakdown. Basically, it outlined what happened and how many pages should be dedicated to a scene. Dialogue and captions would be written and added after the penciled pages were submitted. For Kirby, he would discuss plots with Lee, like who the villain would be and what shenanigans they might be getting up to. Kirby would then draw the entire story without further input. It was not uncommon for Kirby to change or forget details and turn in something that was different than what he and Lee discussed. The appearance of the Silver Surfer in the first Galactus story being a prime example. That was not a character they had previously talked about. It was something Kirby added when he did the artwork. Lee rolled with what Kirby handed in because more often than not, there wasn't time to make radical changes. Not to mention, what Kirby came up with was perfectly fine, or even better than what they had previously discussed. This trust variation, for lack of a better term, also applied to Steve Ditko, the co-creator of Spider-Man. John Romita Sr., who followed Ditko on Spider-Man, also received very little input regarding the actual plot of an issue. Likely there are many more examples, but those are the known, more popular ones. Finally, there's how Lee and Kirby defined their roles, and how each were credited for their contributions. This is the major sticking point, and perhaps the basis for the difficulty in determining who created what. Hi, this is Alan, the voice of Strange Brain Parts. Sorry for the interruption, but I'll make this as brief as possible. Please subscribe and support this channel on Patreon. Links are down below. Thank you. Now back to the video. Lee maintained that whomever came up with an idea created the story or character, whatever the case may be, which is a position that diminishes the role of the artist in the final product. As Steve Ditko once observed, this relegates an artist to a role where they are merely executing someone else's vision. It overlooks the fact that the artist controls the number of scenes in a story and the pace of an issue, not to mention the various character designs. This is not an insignificant contribution. For his part, Kirby stated that he wrote whatever he illustrated. In his opinion, the aforementioned factors, the number of scenes and the pace, was no different than writing a tangible script. For the record, he also provided dialogue suggestions in pencil on the edge of the artwork, or sometimes on the back of the page. This was to help Lee understand what was going on, so there was no confusion when Lee wrote the dialogue. Objectively, this method is, at the very least, co-plotting and co-writing an issue. On the other hand, Lee wrote the dialogue and had final say over the intent of the story. As an example, Kirby intended the introduction of Adam Warlock to be a three-part series that gently explored objectivism, the philosophy endorsed by Ditko. However, after seeing the finished, lettered pages and how Lee ignored his notes, Kirby abruptly ended the Warlock story in the second issue and abandoned plans to have Warlock and the Fantastic Four meet. So, one's opinion of who is the author depends on how one defines the actual writing. Is it the person who plotted the story and provided dialogue suggestions? Or is it the person who made the final decision regarding the story's intent and wrote the dialogue and captions? Not to mention, in this specific Lee and Kirby formula, who contributed what is a nebulous, sliding scale that changed from issue to issue. Lee's suggestions, despite being either used or forgotten by Kirby, did contribute to a story, or at the very least, the direction of a story. Die-hard Kirby fans generally say there is no debate. Kirby did everything, and Lee was a glorified copy editor. Lee fans generally acknowledge Kirby's immense talent, but point out that Lee not only came up with stories and characters, but he also wrote the dialogue and captions, which shaped characterizations. Objectively, it's difficult to make a definitive statement. Both contributed, but that contribution wasn't always a 50-50 split. That's the nature of a collaborative medium, and sadly, an unintended consequence of the Marvel method. One common talking point is the similarities between the Fantastic Four and Kirby's prior creation, the Challengers of the Unknown. The basics of their origins are quite similar. Both teams consist of 4 individuals, and both come together following an aeronautic disaster. After that, the two teams diverge quite noticeably and go in different directions. The Challengers, who don't have superpowers, usually engage in wild adventures. The Fantastic Four, who are superpowered, generally tackle supervillains. The team dynamic for the Challengers is 4 strangers that stay together due to shared trauma. The Fantastic Four are a family that argue, but ultimately realize they're stronger together than apart. Overall, there are similarities, but it's more likely Kirby reused elements that worked for the Challengers and instinctively applied them to the Fantastic Four. Not as a direct, conscious copy, but because he worked fast and had to get pages done. The basic formula worked, so he went with it. This connection is generally used as the foundation of the argument that Kirby solely created the Fantastic Four, and Lee's involvement was minimal, if not non-existent. It's an argument that's not without merit, but it simplifies or ignores the working relationship between Lee and Kirby, mainly as a way to completely diminish Lee's contributions and to greatly elevate Kirby's. Very few details about the creation of the Fantastic Four are solid. The one detail that is accepted at face value is that the publisher, Martin Goodman, instructed Lee to create a superhero team because DC was having great success with the Justice League of America. Goodman either received this information from someone at DC or from someone at the distribution company DC owned, Independent News. It's a minor point, but the exact source of information is in dispute. Regardless, Lee was given that direction from Goodman. After that, the timeline of events and everything else becomes murky. Very, very murky. According to Kirby, he knew Marvel was in dire straits. During a visit to the Marvel office, he noticed Lee was in despair, resigned to the notion the company was a failure. So, Kirby suggested a number of superhero titles, like the Fantastic Four, Thor, and Hulk, because he believed the genre was on the verge of making a comeback. Publishing these comics would reinvigorate the company. Kirby then wrote and drew these titles for Marvel. Lee's involvement was merely as a copywriter, and he had no input into the creation of any of these characters, or their stories. Lee's version of events is that Goodman gave him the assignment to create a superhero team. He went home and told his wife Joan that he was going to quit and get a real job. Joan then suggested that Lee take this superhero team and create a book he would be proud of doing. If it fails, so be it. The worst that could happen is the book would be unsuccessful and Lee would get fired, but at least he would have tried. Lee sat down, wrote the basics of the team, and then assigned Kirby the task of doing the first issue from his outline. Somewhere between these two vastly different stories is the truth. So let's look at the most likely scenario. For the record, the following summary is based on numerous interviews by Lee and Kirby. Your humble narrator attempted to objectively boil them down to the most likely series of events. So consider this an opinion rather than fact. Kirby, who had a falling out with DC, needs employment. He takes work at Marvel, doing unsatisfying creature features. In a moment of serendipity, Kirby goes to the Marvel office, probably to hand in pages, get a check, and ask for another story to draw. Kirby and Lee have a friendly discussion. Lee mentions that he has an assignment from the publisher to create a superhero team. Lee needs an artist he can trust. Kirby loves the idea of doing superheroes. They talk more. They discuss ideas. Out of this comes the Fantastic Four, and very possibly other ideas to pursue if that team is successful. To sell this idea to the publisher, Kirby whips up some character designs. Lee shows these to Goodman, who approves them. With that, the Fantastic Four comic is a go. Within this scenario, there is a lot to debate. Specifically, the exact timeline of events, and whether Lee and Kirby had a discussion in person or over the phone. or for that matter, when Lee had a conversation with his wife, or if that conversation ever actually took place. That said, it seems probable that Lee had to show Goodman something tangible to get his approval before the Fantastic Four went into production. Lee simply couldn't give Kirby an assignment without that consent. So Lee and Kirby had to have had a conversation, or a few conversations, before Lee went to Goodman for approval. Whether character designs were created beforehand is debatable, but quite possible. There's one final detail that needs to be examined. One area of hot debate is the legitimacy of an outline Lee allegedly produced to help Kirby create the characters and the first issue. It is the only document of its kind that exists. No such document for any other Marvel character or series have ever surfaced. And this outline didn't appear until 1966, 5 years after the Fantastic Four were created. At which point, Lee showed it to the assistant editor, Roy Thomas, who may be the only witness to confirm its existence. As a piece of evidence confirming Lee's level of involvement, it is highly suspect. Which isn't to suggest it's not authentic, but its unusual nature, being the only document of its kind, and because it surfaced 5 years after the fact, leads any reasonable person to question its validity. Also, it should be mentioned, Kirby denied he received any type of outline. What cleared up this debate is Stan Lee's deposition in the lawsuit pursued by the Kirby family. A discussion concerning this document did arise in that deposition. Unfortunately, due to a protective order, major portions of that deposition are redacted. However, with a little searching, the original unedited version can be found online. Lee is questioned by the Kirby family's attorney, and the document is not discredited as being fake. If its legal validity was questionable, that might have been an area of discussion and scrutiny. However, it appears to be accepted as a genuine document produced in 1961. That should end the debate concerning its validity. Now, I hate to do this and muddy these waters, but it's worth keeping in mind this was a pre-trial deposition. While it is a sworn, legal proceeding, it isn't testimony at trial before a judge and/or a jury. Lee's testimony could have been Kirby's family laying the foundation to discredit this document at trial. During the deposition, they might not challenge its validity and give away their strategy for trial, which would have been to establish doubt on the document and on Lee's entire version of events. Unfortunately, if this was a legal tactic, we'll never know. The Kirby family settled the lawsuit, presumably in their favor, although the specifics are confidential and not publicly available. Again, that is speculation. From what's available, it appears the 1961 document is genuine. With that in mind, it had to have been typed up after Lee had at least one conversation with Kirby. This is due to Lee mentioning Kirby in the summary. Logically, Lee wouldn't direct a comment at Kirby unless they had talked and Kirby was on board with the project. Before Jack Kirby died in 1994, he spent years trying to get recognition for all the characters and stories he created for Marvel. However, Kirby's main focus was attempting to get his artwork back from the Marvel archives, which turned into a complicated process with provisions that were moderately ridiculous, such as Kirby couldn't sell or display that artwork without Marvel's permission. This process revealed that a large amount of Kirby's work had been destroyed, lost, or stolen outright. To add insult to injury, Marvel only offered Kirby 88 pages of his work, which was an amount not even close to the estimated 13,000 pages he had produced. In the end, Kirby would receive a mere 2,000 pages from Marvel. As per policy, some pages were given to the inker. The remainder, if they exist, are in the hands of private collectors, who may have received them under shady circumstances. Understandably, Kirby was more than a little bitter, especially in interviews during the final years of his life. His version of events from this time are probably a little skewed. More importantly, there was ongoing litigation. Kirby had to be aware that he couldn't make concessions in the press because that would be used in court. So, he focused on highlighting his contributions while dismissing Lee's. In a way, he was using the press to plead his case before it went to trial. Naturally, because of the injustice of the situation, the court of public opinion leaned heavily in Kirby's favor. And there was, for the first time, a conflicting narrative to the one Lee perpetuated. These details contribute to the murkiness concerning the creation of the Fantastic Four and other Marvel properties. As for Stan Lee, Lee was a representative of Marvel Comics for many, many years. By roughly 1980, Lee's involvement with Marvel was rather minimal. Despite a lack of direct involvement, Lee remained an employee of Marvel, but he was a figurehead more than anything. On paper, his main responsibility was to negotiate with Hollywood studios to get Marvel properties on the big and small screen. But mostly, he was a spokesperson, doing interviews and speaking engagements. So he was a company man who had a certain investment in protecting the image of himself and Marvel Comics. One might claim that ego prevented Lee from sharing credit with others, which may be partially true, or a skewed, overly favorable point of view concerning his creative involvement, which may also be true. Regardless, remove Lee from the formula and Marvel would not have been a success. As the editor in charge of everything, his instincts, his input, and his voice were an important element that contributed to Marvel thriving. That has to be acknowledged. That said, Lee had no problem assuming credit for everything he could, as often as he could. Simultaneously, he avoided being specific about how his collaborators contributed to the success of Marvel. Overall, his charming, self-deprecating public persona deflected any questions that probed too deeply into the details of early Marvel, which in turn contributes to the early history of Marvel Comics being unclear. In the end, can a definitive statement be made about who created what for the first issue of the Fantastic Four? No, absolutely not. The most accurate statement one can make is to say it was a co-creation between Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. That may also apply to, roughly, the first year of the series. After that, with Marvel expanding its titles, Kirby took on more of a controlling role. Which isn't to suggest Lee had no creative input whatsoever. He certainly did. He discussed plots and wrote the dialogue, and ultimately, he decided what did or did not get printed. Taking into account the 1961 outline, which supports Lee's claim that he created the team, there are details that are changed, such as Sue being permanently invisible and Ben being a humorless heavy. However, Ben would soften greatly and become the soul of the family. Sue's permanent invisibility also changed. Who and when those changes were made is unknown, but it's likely Lee and Kirby discussed these changes. Again, to hammer the point home, even with the existence of the document, there was clearly a collaboration between Lee and Kirby before and during the first issue. Furthermore, Lee may have had the idea, but Kirby had to visualize it and make it concrete. Therefore, there has to be a division of credit. Both actively contributed. Thank you for watching. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Your ongoing support makes it possible for this channel to continue. I appreciate every single one of you. Please subscribe if you've not already. Leave a comment and a like. I try to keep ads and self-promotional bits like this to a minimum, so if you can, consider directly supporting this channel on Patreon. Extra special thanks to Green Man, Eidolon, Constant Disappointment Records, Jeff Nicholson, Sicken, Francis De La Cruz, Russell Bull, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Ruby St. Dennis, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrew, Corey Drew, L.S. Greger, Brian Deaton, Tom Granis, John Gaunt, James Graham, and Matt Marino. You're all justified and ancient. This is the water, and this is the well. Drink deep and descend. The horse is the white of the eyes and dark within.